In the first video of this series, I showed how that by using sheet metal, simple wood molds, and steel rods for dies, we could fabricate basic sheet metal parts for vintage motorcycles. Today, I'm going to show you an adaptation of that process, which is even easier. I think you'll find it amusing. The Super Pratique throttle was standard issue on most motorcycles from Italy in the 1960s. It's a peculiarly bizarre device. It features an aluminum housing and looks like a standard throttle, but rather than having a tube with a hook on it which actuates the throttle, it has a tube which has a chain on it, and on the end of that chain is a small bucket. A barrel nut is attached to the end of the throttle cable, and that barrel nut is inserted into the chain bucket on the throttle. Now, there's a couple problems with this setup. First of all, if you don't have the throttle cover plate, it doesn't work right. When you twist the throttle, the barrel nut jumps out of the bucket. The second problem is many of the 1960s Italian bikes you find do not have the throttle plate on the cover, and nobody sells replacements anymore. You can't just use a flat sheet of metal and cut it and fit it into the slot because there's not enough clearance for the barrel nut. The throttle will jam if you try this. So basically, you're typically left with having to buy a whole new throttle if you don't have the throttle plate. The throttle plate is actually something of a complex shape. At one end of it, it has a small flat tab with a ridge designed to provide registration. It has a curved bubble section which has been stamped into it over most of its length. And at the end of it, it has a flat section with a hole in it which allows you to secure it to the throttle. Well, given that you can't find a throttle plate anywhere, what do you do if yours is missing? What I'm going to show you today is how to make two versions of a throttle plate that are very, very simple to construct. But first, let me say that unless you need to have a Super Prac throttle, if that plate is missing, buy a $12 Chinese dirt bike throttle, or if you want a really precise throttle, buy a Domino. It has an idler wheel in the cable track, and it operates incredibly smoothly and precisely, and it will cost a whole lot more than $12. So what do we need to do to make our own plate? Well, it's pretty simple. We need a piece of aluminum flashing, a section of 4x4 construction timber about 4 inches long, and some steel rods. There are two versions I'm going to show here, and the first is if you want one which simply functions. It won't look like the original, but it's easy to make. You take a 1/2 inch steel bar and cut it to a length of 1.5 inches long and deburr the ends. Take a piece of 220 sandpaper and rub off the ends, and you're set. If you want to make it so that it actually looks like the original Super Pratique throttle plate cover, you need to take a 1/2 inch bar, cut it 1 7/8 inches long, and cut a 1/4 inch wedge about 1/4 inch from the end of the rod at one end. You can see the idea of it here by just looking at what you're seeing in the movie. Now, you're also going to need a screwdriver to stamp the registration ridge. A big screwdriver won't work at all. A small screwdriver like this one will go right through the flashing. You'll cut a hole in it. How do you find one that's just right? Well, take the tip of the screwdriver and insert it into the wire channel in the throttle, and if it just fits, that's the right size. That's the size the ridge needs to be for the throttle plate. So now we're going to adjourn to Tom's official forgery, which is otherwise known as the sidewalk in front of my house. You want to do this on a hard cement surface rather than dirt or gravel to keep the block of wood solid. Now we're going to use the end grain on the wood, not the side grain. You can use any hammer. I'm using a hammer designed for installing hardwood floors here, but anything will work. The flashing will go on top of the end grain, and then we'll put the die that we've made on that. We want to tape it to the flashing. This will provide some registration, and it'll enable you to find it after you strike it. You're simply going to strike it now, a firm blow. You thought I was kidding when I said you'll want to find it. And the result will be that you've stretched a bubble into the flashing. It's remarkably simple. This version is the version that's functional rather than appearance correct. The appearance correct version requires that the wedge be absolutely parallel to the surface of the flashing. And you can see how it's set up. I've got it taped on. You're probably going to require 3 or 4 attempts at this. I'm doing it once for the purpose of this video, but it's relatively simple. As you can see, I now have a stretched out bubble that has a wedge at one end and a rounded section at the other. It's longer than the version that has a round end at both ends. Now the process is the same for either version. We want to trim off the excess flashing. We do this with standard sewing type scissors. Tin snips actually will not work as well as standard scissors. We want to cut about a 1/2 inch section at the bottom of the bubble area, and that's where we're going to put the registration ridge. We do this by turning it upside down, taking the screwdriver and placing it in the middle of that flat section at the bottom of the bubble and tapping it very lightly. You actually don't need to use a light hammer to do this. You can do it with the palm of your hand. Once we've done this, we've now produced a ridge at the bottom of the bubble that will slide into the wire channel and provide the registration for the cover. Now we're going to start trimming the sides. Obviously, if you cut too much off and get it too narrow, it's not going to work. So you need to take a somewhat judicious approach to the trimming. Cut, measure, cut, measure. It'll take a few extra seconds, but it'll pay off. We're trimming the bottom section first so that the bubble fits flush against the bottom of the channel. That's about perfect there, and we're ready to now bring the sides down to their proper size. We want to leave a little bit extra, maybe a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch along the side of the throttle for finish sanding to make it absolutely perfect. You don't want to try to cut it perfect with the scissors. It will be very hard to be successful if you do so. Now we're going to take, I have a sander set up here to do it with the machine. You can do this with just a flat sheet of sandpaper placed on a flat surface, and it'll come off fast. The flashing sands away very quickly. This again is a process of trial and error. Cut a little bit off, measure it, cut a little bit off. The whole process will literally take 5 minutes or so. It loses its aluminum very quickly when you're sanding it, so it's not a long-term project that's going to take you several days. Once you get it to fit properly, we're going to radius off the ends at the bottom of it and radius the top. This is also a relatively quick process. And as I said, it's the same process whether you're doing the one that's visually correct or the one that's functional. Now this is the result of the functional one. You can see it doesn't look a whole lot like the original uh, Super Prac cover, but it will work fine if you're racing or just want a street rider. And it's taken 5 minutes to do. Uh, this uses the rod that is 1/2 inch, 1.5 inches long, and smooth on both ends. The one that recreates the look of the Super Prac throttle cover plate uh, will take a little longer because you're probably going to have to make several impressions. But I think it comes out pretty good. Uh, you can see what it looks like in operation here. If you wanted to take a diamond pen and scratch the word Super Practique on there, I think there are very few people in the world who would know the difference. This uses the rod that has the wedge ground into it, and either way, it's a fast process, and it works very well. The flashing becomes amazingly rigid once that hump is stamped into it. So it's fully functional. It'll last every bit as well and as long as the original plate. So that's all there is to it. In my book, I have a lot of suggestions on working on vintage motorcycles. So be sure to pick up a couple copies, and uh, you can get them at www.oldtimemoto.com.